Hey community of awesome, I'm Gabe and this is Bookish Pixie. So over the last couple weeks I've gotten a couple questions about how to write third person, especially when you're used to writing first person. While all the books that I published are in first person, I have been working on a couple projects in third, and it very quickly made me realize that I was overcomplicating it in my head and that I had been fully expecting it to be a lot more difficult than it was. The truth is, going from first person to third person can actually be pretty seamless if you're writing third person limited. Third person limited is in opposition to third person omniscient. Omniscient is where you know what everybody is thinking and feeling, which I think is really hard to pull off, whereas limited is focused on one character per scene, just like in first person. The reason I say it's pretty easy to go from first person to third person limited is because you're doing almost the same thing. The main difference is you're using their pronouns and their name more, and you're taking like half a step back. I know the nuance is kind of confusing, especially since like in first person the character is still the one speaking except through I, so let me give a better example. So I'm going to read the first two paragraphs of my newest book coming out in October. Please pre-order, by the way. And I'm going to read the first two paragraphs because it's not spoilery and it's written in first person. So I'm going to do the first person version, which is the published version, and then I'm going to read it as if it were in third person. I do want to caveat that this isn't an exact, so like if it were written in third person, it would be written a little differently, and I'm going to get to that with another example, but this is like a halfway step. So first person, this direct translation, and then actual third person, which we will get to. Demos bet me his bike I would toss up. It's not just any bike either, it's a top-of-the-line model, barely a couple turns old, sleek black and red with aerodynamic angles and a low purr that Day would have completely flipped sand over. His betting something he knows I want, bad, I think was his way of giving me extra motivation not to toss up. As if tasting my food twice with an acid aftertaste a second time wasn't enough of motivation to trying to keep my morning meal down. Okay, so the translated version, so to speak, of third person would go like this. Demos bet Eros his bike, Eros would toss up. It's not just any bike either, it's a top-of-the-line model, barely a couple terms old, sleek black and red with aerodynamic angles and a low purr that Day would have completely flipped sand over. His betting something he knows Eros wants, bad, Eros thinks was his way of giving him extra motivation not to toss up. As if tasting his food twice with an acid aftertaste a second time wasn't enough of motivation to try to keep Eros' morning meal down. So third person limited, right, is kind of that. So you're translating what's going on in the character's head, but you, the narrator, are doing it. It's not the character directly doing it, right? So you're using the character's pronouns, you're using their name, and you're talking about what's in that character's head and what they're thinking and feeling, but you, the narrator, are translating it. The character isn't doing it themselves. So then the final step that can really give it that extra third person punch is that the narrator will sometimes have a bit of a personality or flair that then further translates the voice. So they know what's going on in the character's head, they're describing it to the reader, but they're doing it with a bit of an attitude or with a little bit of a punch or a sparkle or whatever, depending on that narrator and what's right for the tone of that book. And how much you do that or whether or not you do that 100% depends on the manuscript, but that can give it that little extra punch. So to give an example of that, I'm going to read two paragraphs of another project I'm working on that's in third person. Papa says water speaks to those willing to listen. On the night of Mars' birth, the ocean danced and clapped in time with the roaring thunder and unrelenting rain. It was why their parents named Mar after the sea, because the water celebrated so fiercely it nearly sunk La Catalina when Mar took their first breath. The Mar has no memory of their birth, of course. They imagine it was probably a night like tonight, dark as ink and so wet Mar can barely keep their eyes open against a downpour. Fitting, as it's their 17th birthday. So there's kind of an example where like the narrator has a little bit more flowery language than Mar, the protagonist, probably would, and says things like, of course they don't remember their birthday, you know, things like that kind of give it just a little extra spice. And that is the fun that you can have with third person. So basically you want to think first person is where the point of view character is the narrator. They're the ones getting all the information across. Whereas third person limited, the narrator knows everything going on in that point of view character's head and they're getting that across to the reader, but sometimes they add a little bit of their own personality. So that's what I got for today. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe and comment, and I'll see you guys next week.